Nashville, dawn of 1859. The city stirred awake under a thin layer of frost, the streets wrapped in a mist that blurred the outlines of chimneys and church steeples. The morning carried the crisp silence of winter, broken only by the slow creak of wagon wheels and the bark of a distant dog. For most, it was an ordinary day, the kind that promised routine and the quiet march of life. But for the Harper estate, a sprawling plantation near Savannah, this day would not pass into memory as ordinary. It would be marked in blood, forever carved into the whispered stories of those who lived enslaved. Rebecca, a 27-year-old woman who had never known freedom, moved through the grand house like a shadow. Her body bore no visible scars, yet her silence and lowered eyes betrayed years of humiliation. She had been born on this soil, raised under the command of the Harper family, and trained to serve inside their household. Her hands had scrubbed their floors, washed their linens, stitched their clothes, and poured their wine. She had heard their laughter, their quarrels, their philosophies, their prayers, all of it spoken as though she and the others were invisible, as though human ears could not understand. To the Harpers, Rebecca was not a woman. She was an object, something to summon with a snap of fingers, to punish with the flick of a whip, to trade like livestock when convenient. She had learned to carry herself as if her presence should not disturb the air. Even when insulted, even when struck, she lowered her gaze and whispered apologies that did not belong to her. That was survival. That was the mask she wore. Beneath the mask, however, there had once been a different Rebecca. She remembered the brief light of joy in stolen evenings by the fire in the slave quarters. She remembered Daniel. His laughter had been strong enough to warm her even through the coldest nights. His touch, gentle despite the roughness of his hands, had given her a taste of what it meant to be human in a world that insisted she was not. Daniel spoke often of hope. He believed that patience and loyalty might one day be rewarded. He believed that if he bent low enough, the chains might break of their own weight. Edward Harper, the master, had dangled freedom like a carrot before him. If Daniel proved himself trustworthy and obedient, if he endured until spring, the papers would be signed. Rebecca clung to those words, replaying them in her heart like a hymn. She dared to imagine a future in which they might live together as husband and wife in the eyes of the law, raising children not bound by the lash. She pictured a cabin in Nashville, smoke rising from its chimney, Daniel's laughter filling the small rooms. That image had been her shield against despair. But hope on the plantation was always a dangerous thing. One grey morning, Daniel was gone. No warning, no farewell, no explanation. The quarters buzzed with whispers, but no one dared speak too loudly. The truth was revealed slowly, in pieces. Daniel had been sold, secretly, carried away like so many before him. Harper's promise had been a lie, one more chain disguised as a gift. Days later, another rumor arrived, a letter smuggled, a whisper passed from plantation to plantation. Daniel had tried to escape his new owners. He had run toward freedom with desperate courage. But he was caught. The punishment was swift, brutal, designed not only to break his body, but to send a message to others. Daniel did not survive it. For the enslaved community, his death was a lesson. They were meant to learn that hope was fatal. They were meant to whisper his name with fear, to see his fate as a warning carved in flesh. Many did. But for Rebecca, Daniel's death was not an ending. It was a fire. It burned away the last traces of her faith in mercy. It turned the promises of masters into ash. In place of sorrow grew something colder, sharper. She began to look at the Harper family not as masters but as debts unpaid. Each man was a ledger mark, written in blood. Edward Harper, the father, was a man ruled by temper and Dean powder. He fancied himself a patriarch of order and discipline, but his discipline was nothing more than rage sharpened by authority. A misplaced word, a clumsy step, even a glance held too long could drive his hand to his pistol. His cruelty was not calculated but impulsive, as natural to him as breath. James, the eldest son, cloaked his violence in language. He quoted philosophers and legal scholars, justifying slavery as the foundation of civilization. To him, punishments were not cruelty but reason, lashes not pain but education. He beat people not with anger but with cold conviction, as though the words of dead thinkers gave weight to his whip. Michael, the second son, was more loathsome in other ways. Behind the closed doors of the great house, he gave in to appetites that even his family whispered about. The younger enslaved children were not safe under his gaze. Rebecca had heard the stifled sobs, had seen girls returned from his chambers with eyes that no longer held childhood. Yet Michael moved freely, smiling with charm at dinner parties, his sins hidden under the shield of his father's wealth. William, the youngest, wore the cloak of religion. He was a preacher, fond of reading the Bible aloud, his voice heavy with righteousness, but scripture in his mouth was a wee pen. He spoke of obedience, of divine order, of God's will in the bondage of others. Before the lash struck, it was often William's voice that rang out, blessing the cruelty with verses. His piety made him, in Rebecca's eyes, more dangerous than the others, for he rapped chains in the language of heaven. To Rebecca, these 4 men were no longer masters. They were debts. Edward, James, Michael, William. Each name carved itself into her mind like tally marks. She recited them silently in the night, the way others whispered prayers. Each name was a promise of reckoning. The seasons turned, winter deepened, the world expected submission to continue as always. But in Rebecca's heart, the path had already been chosen. She no longer thought of spring as the time when Daniel would be free. She thought of spring as the season when debts would be paid. The dawn of January 6th arrived cold and brittle. Frost clung to the earth like glass, and the fields lay in silence, bare and lifeless. Inside the house, preparations were underway for another day of wealth and command. Servants moved quickly, fires were stoked, and breakfast was readied for the masters. Yet Rebecca's mind was elsewhere. She had sharpened the axe more carefully than usual the evening before, each strike of the whetstone deliberate, each spark a whisper of Daniel's voice. She had practiced splitting logs with a precision that felt more like ritual than labor. Her hands knew the weight of the tool, the arc of the swing, the finality of its edge. What had once been an instrument of labor had become something else, a language of retribution. No one saw the change in her. To the Harpers, she was still the silent servant, the obedient shadow. But within, her thoughts were as steady and immovable as the blade she carried. By the end of this day, the Harper house would no longer belong to its masters. It would belong to silence, to memory, to legend. The morning broke with pale light stretching across the fields, washing the frost in silver. And within that light, Rebecca rose not as the submissive shadow they had always known, but as something else entirely. The Harper family's story was about to end, and hers was about to begin. The night of January 5th melted slowly into dawn, but in the Harper quarters, no sense of celebration softened the air. Beyond the whitewashed walls of the great house, where candles still flickered from the previous evening's merriment, the cabins stood like darkened bones pressed against the frozen earth. The roofs sagged, the doors rattled in their hinges, and the thin walls offered little defense against the winter chill. Inside the cabins, the fire burned low. A few embers pulsed like faint stars at the bottom of a crumbling hearth. Shadows moved quietly, mothers pulling threadbare blankets tighter around their children, men shifting to ease stiff backs pressed against dirt floors, elders coughing deep and hollow. The smell of damp wood, mold, and smoke hung heavy. No hymns rose into the night, no songs of comfort or faith. Where once there might have been melodies hummed to babies or whispered prayers for strength, silence reigned. Chains clinked faintly when someone turned in sleep. That sound replaced music. Rebecca sat by the dim fire, her figure still, her eyes reflecting the glow of dying coals. She had not spoken a word all evening. Others had noticed her quietness, but none asked. Silence was common in the quarters, and grief made people solitary. Yet there was something different about the way Rebecca stared into the embers, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed. It was as if she were listening not to the living, but to the voice of the dead. In her mind, Daniel's face lingered, not as a fading memory, but as a constant presence. His voice echoed inside her, steady, urging, unyielding. She carried that voice into morning. While the enslaved shivered in their cabins, the Harper family awoke to warmth. In the great house, fireplaces roared, casting amber light over carpets and polished furniture. Servants moved quickly through wide hallways, balancing trays, preparing fires, setting the table with porcelain and silver. Candles were replaced with oil lamps, their glow reflected in mirrors that made the house seem endless. The Harper sons, each different in manner yet identical in cruelty, stirred in their rooms. James, the eldest, rose with studied dignity. His desk was stacked with books, Aristotle, Locke, Jefferson, all twisted into arguments justifying slavery as a natural order. He fancied himself a man of intellect, a thinker above the ordinary planters, a philosopher of bondage. At breakfast, he often quoted passages, reciting them with the confidence of one who believed words themselves could cleanse blood from his hands. Michael rose later, often sluggish from the indulgences of the night before. His chamber door was one Rebecca avoided at all costs. Within it, secrets festered. Servants whispered that he lured young girls there, children hardly old enough to understand his touch. They returned from his room broken, eyes vacant, voices gone. Yet Michael walked freely through the house, offering his motherly smiles to guests, laughing loudly at his father's jokes. His cruelty wore the mask of charm, and no one outside the family ever dared expose him. William, the youngest, polished his boots and opened his Bible with a reverence that might have inspired respect had it not been so grotesque. He memorized verses and delighted in delivering them before gatherings, his voice sharp with conviction. To him, Scripture was a whip sanctified by heaven. "Servants, obey your masters," he would thunder before turning to ensure the lash was ready. He believed he was an instrument of God, that every strike was a prayer, every punishment a blessing in disguise. In Rebecca's eyes, William was the most dangerous of all, for he not only inflicted pain, but claimed it was holy. Their father, Edward Harper, commanded the house with his temper. He was a man of broad shoulders and quick hands, and his pistol was never far. He reached for it as other men reached for pipes or pocket watches. A servant tripping on the stair, a misplaced cloth at the table, a hesitation in response, any of these could bring the cold press of the barrel against a trembling head. He thrived on fear, feeding off the silence of those who dared not look him in the eye. To his neighbors, he was respected, a patriarch of wealth. To those in his house, he was a storm sudden, violent, inescapable. The contrast between worlds was merciless. At the Harper table, platters of ham steamed beside bowls of eggs and bread thick with butter. The clink of silver spoons against porcelain accompanied easy laughter. In the cabins, scraps of cornbread and boiled turnips passed for breakfast. There were no silver spoons, no laughter, only the sounds of survival. Rebecca moved between these two worlds. She carried dishes from the kitchen to the dining hall, her figure straight, her steps precise. To the Harpers, she appeared as she always had, obedient, quiet, unremarkable. They noticed nothing of the silence in her eyes, the way her lips pressed tightly as if sealing words forever. To them, she was invisible, but inside her, every step was heavy with decision. She had become a vessel of memory. Every act of cruelty replayed in her mind, the time James ordered a boy whipped until he could not walk, declaring it an education in discipline. The night Michael took a girl and left her too frightened to speak for weeks. The sermon William delivered over the cries of a woman tied to a post. The moment Edward raised his pistol at Daniel simply for hesitating to answer a question. Each event was etched into her as if carved into bone, and layered over all of it was Daniel's death. The cruel lie of promised freedom followed by the reality of sale and slaughter. The Harper men believed themselves untouchable, immortal within their world of land, GNS, and law. They quoted books, wore fine suits, and sat at tables heavy with food, while outside the quarters shivered and starved. But Rebecca saw them differently. She saw men already condemned, their wealth unable to shield them from the truth that awaited. She did not see lords, she saw debts. On that January morning, while laughter rose in the dining room and silence weighed heavy in the cabins, Rebecca sat again by the hearth in the quarters. She did not move, even when others coughed or muttered. Her eyes fixed on the embers' faint glow. The fire was nearly dead, but within her a blaze had taken hold. She was no longer a shadow waiting to be commanded. She was a silence waiting to break. The Harper family ate their meal, speaking of crops, politics, and sermons, utterly unaware that the woman who poured their coffee had already written the final chapter of their story. The quarters trembled with coughs and hunger, unaware that before the next dawn, a new name would be whispered in secret, a name carried in defiance, a name carved into the history of resistance. Rebecca of Nashville. The morning light stretched further across the land, cold and pale. It lit the difference between two worlds, one of comfort and cruelty, the other of chains and silence. And between those worlds sat Rebecca, calm, deliberate, waiting for her hour. The voice of Daniel guided her still. She no longer asked for freedom, she waited for justice. Outwardly, Rebecca moved as she always had. The Harpers never suspected her silence meant anything more than submission. She washed their linens with steady hands, polished their silver until it gleamed, stoked the fireplaces without complaint. To any outsider, she was a servant who had accepted her place, her face as expressionless as the wooden floors she scrubbed. Yet beneath that still mask, everything had already been decided. Her heart beat not with fear, but with certainty. The plan was no longer a dream. It had crystallized into a path she would follow step by deliberate step. Rebecca watched. She memorized every sound of the house. She knew the creak of James's boot upon the third stair from the bottom, the jingle of Michael's keys when he locked his chamber door, the measured rhythm of William's footsteps as he crossed the hall, reciting scripture under his breath. She knew when Edward's temper rose, he often retreated to the dining room, pacing near the decanters of brandy. Nothing escaped her. The knowledge built within her like bricks in a wall, forming a structure of resolve. The axe became her secret companion. It was nothing unusual. Servants often carried it to split wood for the fireplaces. Yet Rebecca touched it differently. She sharpened it not as a chore, but as a ritual. Each strike of the whetstone was slow, deliberate, sending sparks into the cold night air. Others thought she was only diligent in her work. But to Rebecca, every sound of metal against stone was Daniel's voice, echoing in memory. Do not bow forever. Each scrape was a rehearsal, each glint of the blade a promise. When she carried wood into the house, she practiced the weight of the tool, the angle of her arms, the firmness of her grip. She did not swing wildly, she measured. She studied the arc, the moment of impact, the silence afterward. She pictured faces with every motion. James, Michael, William, Edward. Their names were engraved into her strikes. Each piece of wood that split clean under the axe became another invisible blow already delivered, one strike closer to retribution. The signs of her preparation were invisible to the family. They were too certain of their own power, too blind to believe a servant could harbor more than obedience. Yet among the enslaved, some sensed a change. They saw the quiet fire in her eyes, the way she lingered near the axe longer than necessary, the way she stared into the embers as if she were seeing something no one else could. Still, no one questioned her. Silence was survival. Whatever plan Rebecca carried in her heart was her own, and in that silence, others found refuge. The night before it happened, the house lay quiet, its halls breathing with the heavy slumber of masters who believed themselves safe. But Rebecca did not sleep. She rose from her cot and stepped barefoot through the quarters, out into the bitter cold. The moon shone pale upon the yard, silvering the frost-covered ground. She walked to the woodpile, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what was to come. She lifted the axe and felt its cold handle against her palm. The blade glimmered faintly in moonlight, a reflection of her resolve. She pressed it against the whetstone one final time. Sparks rose like fireflies into the night. When dawn came, the air was brittle with frost, and the estate stirred as it always had. Servants moved quietly through the halls, stoking fires, carrying trays, fetching water. But Rebecca's steps carried her beyond routine. Her path was already chosen. James Harper was the first. He sat in his study, hunched over books and papers, quill scratching words into the margins of a leather-bound volume. His lips moved silently, reciting lines of philosophy, perhaps preparing an argument he would later deliver over breakfast. The room smelled of ink, leather, and smoke from the dying fire. He did not hear her at first. Servants came and went often, but Rebecca's hand gripped the axe as though it had grown from her arm. She moved behind him, her breath steady, her eyes fixed. James began to turn, perhaps to demand an explanation for her presence. His words never came. The silence in his study became eternal, no longer filled with the droning of philosophers. Michael was next. His chamber door was locked, as it often was when he indulged in his vilest appetites. Rebecca knew what she would find inside, and the thought only hardened her resolve. She used the ring of keys he so carelessly carried, stolen silently days earlier. The door creaked open. Inside, the room smelled of sweat and perfume. In the corner, a young enslaved girl cowered, locked away, her small body trembling. Michael's smile vanished when he saw Rebecca standing with the axe. He opened his mouth, perhaps to charm, perhaps to threaten. He had no time for either. Rebecca's strike was swift, and the lock upon the girl's prison fell away. Rebecca led her out, placing her trembling hand into safety, a gesture as much symbolic as real. William met his end in prayer. He had just finished breakfast and lingered in the small parlor, Bible open upon his lap. His lips moved, shaping verses that praised obedience and condemned rebellion. When Rebecca entered, he lifted his eyes, surprised but unafraid. He believed too deeply in his own righteousness to imagine danger. Perhaps he thought she had come to serve, to carry out some small task. He began to recite aloud, his voice rising like a sermon. "Servants, obey your masters." The verse ended in silence, broken not by amen, but by finality. Edward Harper did not die so quietly. He was in the hallway when the sound of footsteps and faint cries alerted him. His hand went instantly to his pistol. Fury twisted his face as he called out, his voice booming through the house. Rebecca ran, not in fear, but in purpose, drawing him into the dining room, where the long table still bore the remains of last night's feast. Platters of half-eaten meat, glasses stained with wine, crumbs scattered across embroidered cloth. All the symbols of excess and cruelty stood witness. Edward stormed in, one raised, shouting threats. Rebecca moved swiftly around the table, drawing him further in. His shite rang out, shattering glass echoing through the chamber. But rage made him careless. She closed the distance, the axe flashing in the morning light that poured through tall windows. Among the dishes and spilled wine, Edward Harper's story ended. The great house fell into silence, the laughter, the sermons, the smug philosophies all extinguished. What remained was the hollow stillness of justice delivered by hands long thought powerless. Rebecca stood in the dining room, breath steady, clothes marked with the work she had done. She did not flee. She did not hide. She lowered herself into a chair at the table, surrounded by the remnants of a feast that would never be finished. The axe rested by her side, its blade quiet now. Outside, the morning continued as though nothing had changed, the frost melting slowly from the fields. But within the Harper estate, a new silence reigned, one born not of fear, but of reckoning. At dawn, the Harper house was not filled with hymns or sermons, nor the laughter of its masters. Instead, silence lay over the estate like a burial shroud. The rising sun crept through tall windows, catching on broken glass and stains across the dining room floor. Smoke from the extinguished lamps drifted faintly in the hallways, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. The estate, once so loud with commands and punishments, had fallen into a hush that seemed unearthly. Rebecca sat at the dining table as though she were a guest invited to feast. Her posture was straight, her hands calm, her breathing even. The axe rested against the chair beside her, silent now, its work completed. Before her lay the remnants of last night's supper, a platter of roasted meat gone cold, a bottle of wine spilled into embroidered cloth, bread crusts scattered like bones. It was a grotesque still life, the wealth of the Harpers now paired with their ruin. She did not run. She did not attempt to hide in the woods, as so many fugitives had done. Instead, she waited, as though the final act of her plan required witnesses. When footsteps finally approached, it was not masters but servants, their faces pale, eyes wide as they peered into the dining room. The sight froze them. Rebecca seated calmly among the remains, the masters fallen, silence heavy. No cry of triumph escaped her, no explanation. She simply was. Word spread with terrifying speed. By mid-morning, neighbors arrived, summoned by frantic messengers. They entered the house with pistols drawn, their boots echoing against the wooden floors. They expected rebellion, chaos, perhaps the entire household risen in revolt. What they found was one woman, composed and unflinching, seated among the ruins of the Harper family. The bodies of Edward and his sons lay as mute testimony to her work. The arrest was swift, though not without hesitation. Some men muttered of madness, others of witchcraft. They could not reconcile the image before them. A woman they had known only as a silent shadow had brought down 4 men who believed themselves untouchable. Shackles were fastened to her wrists, yet she did not resist. She rose from the chair with the same calm with which she had sat in it, her eyes steady, her silence unbroken. The trial followed quickly, almost perfunctory. Nashville's courtrooms were not places of fairness for the enslaved. Newspapers reported on the event with words chosen to soothe the fears of white readers. A servant woman driven to madness has slaughtered the Harper men in an act of bloody reprisal. Madness. This word became the explanation, for it was easier than acknowledging intent. To admit that Rebecca had acted with calculation, with reason, with justice, would be to admit that bondage itself had birthed rebellion. Madness excused the crime without indicting the system. Rebecca stood in the dock, her presence unyielding. Questions were asked, witnesses called, evidence displayed. She spoke little, offering no defense, no plea for mercy. When asked why she had done it, she answered only once, her voice low, clear, unwavering. There was no freedom in spring, only death. Her words rippled through the courtroom like a chill wind. Many claimed not to understand her, but among the enslaved who heard, every syllable rang like truth. The sentence was inevitable, death by hanging. The court delivered it swiftly, as though eager to close the matter. To the officials, it was not only Rebecca who was on trial, but the very idea that the enslaved could rise against their masters. Her execution would be a warning, a line drawn in blood meant to deter others from daring to dream of vengeance. Yet long before the gallows were built, Rebecca's name had already slipped from the courtroom into the cabins, the kitchens, the fields. Whispers carried her story across plantations, carried by those who labored under chains, yet found in her act a spark of defiance. They called her Rebecca of Nashville. Some spoke her name with fear, others with reverence, but none forgot it. In the quarters at night, her story was retold in hushed tones. Children too young to remember Daniel learned of him through the tale of Rebecca. Mothers, rocking infants in their arms, whispered her name as a warning and as a promise. Men who felt the sting of the lash thought of the woman who had struck back. She had not fled into the woods, hunted like an animal. She had faced her masters in their own house, and when the sun rose, she sat among them unafraid. That image became legend. The newspapers called her monstrous, but the enslaved called her something else, brave. In the hush of night, they imagined her spirit walking among them, carrying the axe still, watching over those who dreamed of freedom. Each retelling grew sharper, stronger, until Rebecca was no longer only a woman, but a symbol that even silence could hide fire, that even shadows could wield justice. On the day of her execution, the square filled with townsfolk. Curiosity drew them. Fear kept them tense. Rebecca was brought forth in chains, yet she did not stumble. She walked with calm steps, her gaze fixed ahead, her silence intact. Some whispered prayers, others jeered, but none could deny the strength in her bearing. When she stood upon the scaffold, the rope around her neck, she looked out over the crowd without trembling. The executioner asked if she had last words. She said none. She had spoken already in the Harper house, through action, through silence heavier than sermons. The lever was pulled and Rebecca's body fell, but her name did not. That night in the cabins of Nashville and beyond, voices carried the story. It spread along roads, across fields, whispered in markets, murmured at river docks. Her name became a secret password of defiance, Rebecca of Nashville, a servant who did not flee, who did not beg, but who rose with an axe at dawn and ended a dynasty of cruelty. The Harper estate, once a monument to wealth and power, fell into decline. Without Edward and his sons, the household withered. Neighbors took control, debts were settled, land was divided. But the silence that hung over the property never lifted. Travelers said the house seemed haunted, its windows like empty eyes, its halls echoing with an absence that could not be filled. Some swore they heard the faint sound of chopping wood, though no fires burned within. Others claimed to see a figure seated at the dining table, a woman in plain clothes, her eyes calm, waiting. History books did not write her name. Official records marked only a crime, a punishment, a note of madness. But among those who remembered, she lived. She lived in the whispers of mothers, in the prayers of the weary, in the songs sung secretly by the brave. She became proof that even within chains, resistance could rise. Years later, long after the Harper house crumbled, her legend endured. For some she was a ghost, for others a martyr, but for all she was a story that refused to die. The South remembered her not because it wanted to, but because silence could not bury her. Rebecca of Nashville, not servant, not shadow, legend.